Today, ladies and gentlemen, our learning series will drive deep into what proficiency gaps we see as an industry and how we can focus on improving these with benchmarking and upskilling employees, directly impacting excellent deliverables to our clients. All right, so we are very privileged today to have with us a thought leader from Immersion who has spent the last 20 years working on English language assessment, teaching, and administration. He is currently the Director of Language Assessment at Immersion and has advanced company strategies through developing and furthering innovations in language assessments. He will be discussing today's topic on language proficiency gaps. What are these? What are they? And what can we do about them? So, ladies and gentlemen, let's give a warm CCAP welcome to Mr. Judson Hart. Hi, Judson.
Hello.
Right, take it away. The floor is yours.
For that enthusiastic and energetic introduction. I don't know how you do it, Jay. It's pretty early in the morning there.
Well, we got vitamin C and vitamin D.
Lots of sunshine.
Lots of sunshine. We're in a tropical country anyway. All right, go ahead. Floor is yours.
Conversation never drags, Jay. You just hop in and pump us up with some of that energy. But I think it will be an exciting discussion. I hope that my part is meaningful and that it generates some good discussion in the panel discussion that will follow some of the things that I present. I'll be sharing screen today. The resources that I share, I'd be happy to share with you and your team so that you can spread some of these learnings as far and as wide as they possibly can go. As I concluded my preparations today, I thought, well, this has been really great. Why have I enjoyed my preparation as much as I have? And I realized, sorry about that, I just hit the wrong button, that the topic of today's discussion, language gaps, is so close to our mission. At Immersion, as introduced by that video, we're on a mission to close the global communication gap. We know that around the world, there are individuals with language skill. We want to make sure that we're connecting them with the opportunities that they have to use that language skill to open opportunities for employment, for education that will further them in their lives. We take that mission very seriously and we orient our work each day towards that mission. And so the topic of today's discussion around the proficiency gaps that have been evidenced in some of the data that we've collected from Philippines and from around the world, I think will be really meaningful and has been rewarding for me to look at. I recognize that we're at the beginning of the workday for you in the Philippines. As introduced by Jay, I think so highly of the contact center professionals in the Philippines. The Philippines is a special place in our Immersion heart. The company's ideals and concepts were really formed out of work in the Philippines by some of our founders and the needs that they saw in there. You certainly have been, as a collective group, thought leaders in the industry. And I think pioneers really would maybe be the best word to describe contact center work in the Philippines. Pioneers become fossils if they don't continue to learn. And I respect so highly those of you that are here with us today, ready to engage in this topic, to ask questions and to learn and to keep learning, to continue furthering the work in your professional spheres of influence. Recognizing that it is important and that some of you may not be able to stay to the conclusion of the hour that we'll be together, I wanted to front some of the key takeaways that we'll discuss in detail as we go on. So if you have to leave, we'll miss you and wish you the very best in your work, but we want you to take with you some of these things that we'll discuss in length. So full spoiler alert, I'm going to do my best to give you all the secrets up front, and then we can proceed with some of the discussion in more detail. Some of the things that we'll share with you today include that from the data that we've collected with our adaptive automated assessment that's measuring language performance all around the world, it does look like a gap is emerging between top performers in the Philippines and global competitors. And I think you'll be interested in seeing some of that data. From our assessment in multiple skills, including speaking and writing, Writing is becoming increasingly important in contact center work. We see that through the development of omni-channel roles with agents responding in voice, but also in chat and email. And proficiency as measured in each of these areas, there's a distance there between an agent's ability to speak and write in the Philippines. And I think you'll find that interesting as well. When we surveyed hiring professionals around the world related to contact center work, there's a lack of confidence that new hires have language skill in two critical areas that we're excited to share with you what those areas are, and then have a discussion about implications for that. One of the things that we feel like may be contributing to this gap in critical areas is deficiencies in currently used assessment products and practices. As the video introduced, we've done a lot of innovation in this area. We feel excited to share with Philippines and the world really what these innovations are and how they can improve processes and the learning around that, increase the reliability of the language data that's being used to make important hiring decisions, and that will address some of the concerns that we see specifically as we've looked at some instances in the Philippines areas where there's a disconnect between the measurement that's happening and the reality of language performance in the area. Finally, we'll look at how one of the key ways of measuring language performance previously, this idea of a human rated or a human moderated language assessment or interview style assessment, is resistant to change. And in order for us to continually improve our systems in an efficient way, we may need to look at, as we have it at Immersion, ways of using assistive technologies to help improve these practices. And then at the very end, for those of you who do kind of bear with us and are able to make time today, there's a lightning round of learning around a couple of other topics that I think you'll find very interesting. So without any further description or delay, we'll jump into some of these learnings. As we've introduced, because Immersion uses adaptive and automated technology to score language performance, specifically in this case speaking, it enables us to take data from all around the world and compare performances in these different areas. So this represents about 250,000 completed assessments over the last year from these different areas. As you know, you're maybe most interested in the Asian Pacific area specifically and predominantly from detail from Philippines contact centers. We see that when we look at average performance relative to these global areas, the Philippines right there in kind of the center of what that performance looks like. If you're familiar with statistics, you know that from an average, you can learn, and learning is extended by a term called standard deviation or distance from that average. As we look at extending out from that average to further proficiency or further ability, this idea of a strong candidate. So we have an average candidate represented in orange, a strong candidate represented in yellow, and then an exceptional candidate or one whose two standard deviations from the average, we see the spread of performance. Kind of one thing that surprised me is that the standard deviations, when we look at the data from the Philippines area, are narrower, meaning there's not as much reach in the ability of what's being measured there in the Philippines. So where average agent performance is similar to around the world, when we get into the strong and exceptional candidates, there starts to be a slide from what we see in some of these other global areas. Something that I think would be worthy of our discussion as we move forward, how we can extend that skill of strong and exceptional agents to be more competitive in the global contact center world. So in case my explanation wasn't clear, this first key takeaway related to gap one is that the Philippines is certainly right there in the thick of ability and performance when it comes to average agent performance. But there does seem to be a gap emerging or a distance emerging between strong and exceptional performance in relation to other areas. As introduced in the introduction, one of the things that I heard early in my time at Immersion was this emerging reality of a need for assessments beyond just voice work or speaking skill. That we heard consistently that contact centers were opening up groups that were focused on chat and email. I think the pandemic really cracked open the need for asynchronous and synchronous, but not voice or face communication. And we've seen, a radical increase in the requests for solutions around evaluating agents' skill in writing in addition to their skill in speaking. As we have with clients around the world, we've seen an increase in the use of a writing assessment product that we released last year, the beginning of that in the Philippines, in other areas as well. As we've collected that data, though, interestingly, where average agent performance in the Philippines is around a B2 or a 6.8 on our immersion True North scale. When we look at the ability set of a similar kind of distribution of agents in terms of their writing ability, we see a marked difference there, or a gap emerging between that speaking skill and the writing skill, where average skill registers closer to a B1 than a B2. It's certainly not without note here that the frequency with which we're testing for writing ability is different than the frequency with which we see Philippine clients using our speaking assessment. And in my early education, they taught us that what you love, you test for. And so if we want to see an increase in this skill, we need to match that with assessment, that through that assessment we'll learn and validate the need for writing proficiency skill. When we were developing the writing assessment that I mentioned we released last year, we did a lot of learning around why test for writing. In addition to the actual work to be done in supporting clients' email, chat needs, we also found that since the pandemic moved so much of our work remotely, it moved a lot of our internal administrative components outside of a face-to-face direct communication mode into a chat mode, or into a use of Teams or Slack or another one of these communication tools. So again, kind of matching pace with the way in which our work has changed since the pandemic opened up so many opportunities for distributed work. Hiring managers are looking at assessing agents' ability to communicate effectively, not just for outbound work, but really for the internal work that needs to be done. So that's takeaway 2, that there appears to be in the Philippines, and it's not unique there. We see it in other degrees in other areas as well, that there's a deficit between what many agents can do from a speaking perspective and then what we observe when we measure their other skills, especially that writing ability. And that will have implications as more and more work is considered multi-skill work that needs to be done, and may increase friction related to some of the remote work communication that we've all been doing a lot more of since the pandemic began. I wanted our discussion in the panel section to be a little bit more specific and focused in some of the different areas in which we see language skill being applied. We can talk about someone's ability to perform generally, but I think the professionals that have gathered here today deserve a discussion that's a little bit more direct and specific to the work that they do each day. When we look at how language performance ability is applied in contact center work, it emerges certain characteristics of what that work will look like and how that work will be performed. In our attempt to kind of learn and understand, we've had conversations around what are kind of the characteristics that a top performing voice agent at a contact center would need to display. And from a hiring perspective, really, what are we looking for when we're evaluating language ability within this specific use case of contact center work? So there were these 16 characteristics that emerged from some of the research that we did about what skills are necessary for someone to demonstrate and display consistently in order to be a top performer. We took these to a group of contact center professionals like those gathered here through 2 different surveys. One survey looked at each of these 16 characteristics through the lens of importance. So from less important to more important, how important were each of these characteristics to hiring managers and contact center administrators around the world? And then we followed up with the learning from that first importance survey with a survey that looked at what are we seeing in agents that have just been hired? Are we confident or less? Are we more confident or less confident that an agent has each of these characteristics and is ready to perform the work connected to that language skill? So again, these questions were the same characteristics were presented through 2 different surveys, one around importance and one around confidence. What looking at these questions in combination allowed us to do was add some spatial dynamic to our interpretation of the data. So on one axis, we had less importance and high importance of a characteristic. And then similarly, we looked at high confidence and low confidence to create a more dynamic picture of the data. What this enables us to do is look at the grouping of these characteristics in quadrants. In this quadrant, we have low importance and admittedly low confidence issues. We could consider them passes. Of course, we want agents to demonstrate all skill, but the fact that even that these were less confident in a factor that falls in this quadrant is more acceptable to us because it's been identified as less important. Characteristics that fall into this quadrant are encouraging in that we see them with high degrees of confidence being displayed by recent hires, but it's a little bit less maybe significant or notable that we're confident because they've been identified as less important. In quadrant 3, these are the wins. This lets us know that we're doing something right, that the mechanisms with which we're filtering prospective hires and the way that employees are coming to us has the skill characteristics that we're looking for. And we're confident that we're seeing the skill that we need. So there's no gaps in what we're desiring to see and what we're proving out to see as an agent begins work. The area that I think today's discussion is the most interested in is this area of characteristics that have been identified as being highly important to the work that needs to be done. But kind of concerningly, we are less confident that we're getting what we need and what we expect to get from a new hire. So without further kind of discussion, let's look at where these 16 characteristics fell as we plotted out the responses to the survey. Encouragingly, we had a distribution of the data here kind of from lower left to upper right, which is what we want to see if there's a relationship between these 2 questions that we're asking. We would expect that. Also, from my perspective, encouragingly, the things that fell here in the pass column are less language related and more kind of related to other dynamics of the job. And here in this quadrant, the win quadrant, are the things that we want to see, that we've identified as important, and that we are seeing. There's a lot here that's happening in a positive way for contact centers around the world. We're getting some of these important characteristics. We're confident in the characteristics that we're seeing. It was surprising to me, but also motivating considering the work that we do at Immersion, that the 2 that were both important and that hiring managers are less confident in is that an agent has the language skill that they need to speak clearly and articulately from the time that they begin their work, suggesting 2 things. that there's a need for increased precision in our ability to screen for language proficiency, not just so that we don't hire an individual, but that we are more empowered when it goes to upskilling their ability so that they can better and more confidently reach that expectation. And then also that there's a lack of confidence in an agent's ability to efficiently and quickly respond to the questions and needs that arise in the daily work. I'm confident that as we move to the panel discussion, there will be those that can have a thought or an opinion related to the deficiencies observed that maybe are reflected here in this data. If you're keeping track, we're here to kind of the gap 3 takeaway, that there is certainly a need, as this data evidences, for better processes and products to address these gaps in hiring managers' confidence. Around the world, there's a need for people who are hired to do contact center work to be able to immediately rise to challenges that include communicating with clarity, with accuracy, and then efficiency as they respond to questions and problems. In terms of what's leading to this gap, I felt like there was a couple of specific call outs to data that we've collected at Immersion that help identify some problems that there are. First, with problem 1, we've got to acknowledge the reality that there are some commonly used assessments for the purposes of hiring and screening that don't create useful and necessary discrimination between candidates of low ability and high ability, and that there is misalignment in the data that those assessments generate with language frameworks, ways of thinking about and talking about language performance in an accurate and meaningful way. As my role allows opportunity to do often, we were working with a client who was looking at our immersion products as a solution to, or a substitution for the products that they had been using. I've been working long enough here at Immersion in this role that I have certain expectations when we come to this type of data. And so I was excited to move along the process, but very quickly I was surprised by some of what I was seeing in the data that they were sharing with us. As often happens, we had set up an experiment with this company where they were continuing to use their existing test product and then simultaneously testing prospective hires with our assessment products. And then we were looking at the data from these 2 tests. The data that they shared from their existing assessment product, they described as being similar to what they had seen in the past. They identified that agents are typically hired with the test score being converted to the CFER scale, with agents hiring at an A2 on this test score, which struck me as quite lower than I would expect, given what conversations I've had with other contact centers. So I followed up with some questions asking about, well, what are the specific types of work that these agents will be doing? And in the description of the work, what they were describing was not work that could be done by someone with an A2. It would certainly be done more like I would anticipate by someone with a B2 ability. So we did as we do, we looked at their test data that showed us not a lot of difference between one test candidate and the other test candidates, the majority of which came in at this A2 level, some performing more closely to a B1 level. Surprisingly, when we stripped out some of the variability and unreliability that occur when you're using an assessment product that has a lot of human scored components, we saw a lot more colorfulness in the data, a lot more actionable colorfulness in their data. It is true that there was A2 speakers in their assessment or their hiring pool, but the majority of them were what we would expect to see from hiring in that area. B1s, B1 pluses, and B2s made up the majority of their data. There were agents that were performing at levels not described by the assessment. To me, this is highly significant in that your data, the usefulness, the opportunities to use the data is only as good as the precision of the assessment. This assessment might be confident that it's accurately measuring people because it's very conservative in its measurement of people, but it creates a lot of limitations in what we learn, and it might misalign or misinform other efforts that might be occurring. I think as we'll get to in the panel discussion, given my background in language teaching and language learning, no one is a stronger advocate that people can improve their language skills than I am. But I also know from my experiences that it's important that I know where someone is at before I attempt to improve their ability. If I'm developing upskill curriculum that is trying to help someone move from an A2 to a B1, but they're actually already at a B2, that curriculum or upskill curriculum is not going to be very successful. So in addition to complications in this situation and concerns that I had around the hiring decisions that were going to be made using this language data from this assessment, I had further concerns as we moved from hiring to talking about a way of improving employee skill, that the understanding and knowledge that would best fuel those curricular interventions wasn't going to be achieved with the existing test product. I think that among those who have joined us today, there are probably a lot of people that have participated in the types of language evaluation that the intro video described, interview style conversations with candidates to assess language performance that are kind of slotted in between other important work that someone might be doing. If screening for language ability by that type of conversation is certainly possible, and for many decades, it was the best that we had. However, what we've seen with the evolution of technologies like the ones that we use for our automated assessment, we're not limited to just the ways in which we've measured language performance previously, that there are powerful and reliable ways for us to use technology responsibly to help us make informed decisions as part of a hiring process in who has the language skill that we need. One of the things that we've observed consistently as we've helped companies adopt some of this automated approach to language assessment is that it gives them a lot more powerful tool to adapt and adjust the way they act on the data that they've received through their language testing processes. Not only is human rated data less reliable and demanding of a lot of time and resources, it's less actionable because of how humans think about and make decisions. That was evidenced really powerfully by another kind of client that we looked at where they had given us access to data that they had generated through an assessment process that was very thorough and very detailed, very well thought out. It was raising some concerns and problems for them over time though. And this one's borne out in this data that we see. Similar to our assessment scale, which was a 100-point scale that tries to describe language performance across that entire language scale, their assessment as well had the capacity of assigning ability scores across all 100 points on their scale. Language evaluator would assess candidates in 5 different areas, total those 5 different areas to create a summed score, which could vary from 0 to 100. However, what we saw when we looked at some of the frequency description of their data is that as humans are likely to do, the data was being grouped at the edges or the boundaries of a certain decision. So candidates that were being scored right before they or right at the point they should be hired, or right at the point they should enter into the instructional program. There were many fewer candidates that fell in between these different levels. Well, the problem with this is if there is a need for me to adapt my test score, let's say that I have an opportunity to increase the work that a client needs to be done, but I need more agents to do that. and I decide to be a little bit more adaptive in, let's see, I might not be able to edit that. If I wanted to lower this threshold where I'm hiring an individual, I have to lower it way down in order to meaningfully increase the number of applicants that I'm passing through. Contrastingly, if I get feedback from a client that my language performance of my agents is insufficient and they want me to increase my ability, I can't easily make a small change to meaningfully increase or meaningfully restrict who I'm hiring without eliminating all of my pool. In contrast to that, an automated solution like we use on the immersion speaking assessment creates much more discrimination between scores of individual candidates, which allows me to adapt in increments up and down a threshold until I'm able to calibrate it right at a level that's giving me what I need. If I need more candidates to make it through a particular checkpoint in the process, I can lower my threshold, not in such a way that I collapse under the shift or the change, but just enough that I can reach the benefit and manage the consequences of that change. So again, automated assessments can address some of this language gap in a way that's a lot less extreme, a lot less expensive. It allows me to learn and as we use the word iterate, make small changes to improve my processes over time. It feels like we're getting close to the end, and we are getting close to the end of the presentation component to today's discussion, but I wanted to end with a few just kind of lightning learnings that we came away with as we surveyed around the important or the confidence question earlier referenced. We wanted to learn a little bit about some of the other things I think that are relevant to our discussion. When we talk about gaps in skill, I think it's reasonable for us to wonder, well, if we were to make up those gaps, if new hires were to be had greater skill, would they be paid more? Would there be an economic incentive for someone to close that gap? And the survey respondents were pretty strong in saying that yes, in the hiring practices used at their contact center, if an agent arrives with greater ability, they would receive a greater pay at the initial hiring. One of the other kind of exciting and interesting phenomenons that we're seeing is hiring for more than one performance in more than one language. So we see candidates who are taking phone calls in both English and in Spanish, in addition to maybe the native language work that they do. The question being, does this additional skillfulness that an agent bring increase language pay or increase agent pay? And it does in many of the contact centers around the world. I think this is a real credit to the contact center profession that there is resources applied towards employee upskilling, helping people grow through their work or in addition to the opportunities of growth that the regular work allows, that there's resources made available for people to grow their skills as they do that. Similarly, we're seeing encouraging things in terms of compensation around upskilling, that as an employee takes advantages of resources and opportunities related to upskilling, there's opportunities for them to increase their pay as well. Is there a benefit? We talk a lot, and it's kind of a big area of discussion currently, this idea of the great, it has lots of names, but the shakeup, or an employee seems to be in a little bit more of an empowered position. There's a lot of need for work. People are changing jobs frequently. Any organization has to manage retention in ways that maybe before they didn't need to. Is there a payback when an organization invests resources and compensation in upskilling? And the respondents to this survey were very affirming that yes, employees who or employers who take care and take time and resources towards upskilling receive compensation in the form of increased levels of retention. I think that wraps up some of the key points of discussion that I wanted to preview before we get to the panel discussion that will open up for questions that people might have.
All right. Thank you, Judson. We'll see you at the panel discussion.
Hello,
Yeah,
magandang hapon po. Pwede po kay Sir Wilfredo Tanola?
hello. Hello. Can anyone hear? I just heard someone calling in someone. I thought we're already digital and the party lines don't exist anymore, but I guess it still does. Anyway, so Johnson, excellent presentation. The only thing I would point out is that the Philippines seems to be missing in your map. Okay.
Oh, yes. Yeah, that's fair. It was not a very detailed drawing of the world.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. All right. But anyway, so ladies and gentlemen, coming up is the panel discussion on language proficiency gaps. And this is going to be moderated by Chris Pasion. All right. Chris is the HR director for Nearsol Philippines Incorporated, and she has been in the contact center industry since 2001 and started as an agent in operations. And she shifted to HR in 2009 and has since become an advocate of HR being an enabler in the organization. Joining the panel with Chris is the group manager of resource management group of Tech Mahindra BPS APAC in the Philippines. He has 15 years of end-to-end staffing and selection experience across various verticals and services in the BPO and IT industries. He has led strategic and tactical recruitment strategies as well as transformation projects to achieve hiring efficiencies in meeting business goals. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a hearty welcome to Gerard Lopez and of course, Judson. Please join the panel. Thank you so much for everybody. Chris, take it away. The floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Judson, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. That was very interesting. You know, I'm pretty sure that a lot of our viewers, our guests today are from recruitment, and it is true that there's actually a language proficiency gap in the industry that we all need to be looking into if you want to be able to get better talents and help upskill them and help develop them. Gerard, good morning. How are you today?
Hi, good morning, guys. I'm good.
Okay.
Nice to meet everyone.
Okay. So without further ado, I would like to check on our chat box. I see a lot of, well, some questions. There's one here, Judson, I think, you know, a very good question after the presentation. The question's coming from Maricel, and she said, what do you consider as indicators when you are assessing the confidence level? You talked about that a bit during your presentation. And then she said, how will you know it's low confidence or high confidence?
Sure. And just to clarify a little bit about kind of the instrument that was used to collect this data, it was a survey that presented the questions to hiring managers. So, you know, we define confidence as the evidence that they have from day one that someone could do that particular thing. So starting on day one, how confident are you that an agent could handle multiple calls? And then they were rating that on a 6-point scale that's commonly used for this type of research of from low confident to high confidence. So some of like what confidence means and what it represents is a mystery to even us. It resides in the minds of the hiring manager. But that was how we framed that question is, would you expect someone to be able to do this from day one? Yes or no? So,
okay.
confidence has a lot of different meanings.
That's true. I hope that answers the question of Marisol. Thank you, Johnson. When I was viewing your presentation, there was something that's very interesting that popped up. You said that language proficiency uh, tests now just doesn't focus on the spoken language, but there's also, because of the pandemic, and there are more jobs opening up, requirements for talents, and we're also looking at written
Mm.
written proficiency now. How much of the market we have in the contact center in the Philippines are being more conscious of the written proficiency tools and requirements? Would you say, like, b- compared
Sure.
to, say, 5 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I want to make sure that, Gerard, you have a chance to answer the question too, given that you'll have maybe a lot more specific detail. It's a really poor measure probably of how much demand there is. But I look at kind of within the data that I used for that particular conclusion, we saw about a 1-to-3 ratio of assessments consumed for speaking versus for writing. In terms of historically what that has been like, I'm newer to looking at language proficiency for contact centers, so I don't have anything older than that, other than we have seen increasing rates of growth and use of that writing assessment, suggesting to me kind of pressures and demands for that type of skill confirmation as part of hiring in a kind of an exponential way. So more and more, I think it's a critical skill set that's being evaluated by hiring managers.
You're on mute, Gerard.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, and that's correct. I've been dealing with a lot of sort of like deals currently, and it has actually grown in the Philippines, although I'm not sure in terms of the percentage. But in terms of the deals that, for example, we are currently into, omni-channel work is getting more and more prevalent, not just in the Philippines, but in the APAC region, where customers are mostly focusing on social media, email, rather than voice and hotline. So it's becoming more important to basically gauge the written communication skills as well of the candidates, not just voice. Because if you do the omni-channel, then basically they're going to be universal agents doing voice, email, chat. And I've seen that really grow in the Philippines, more specifically so in the Metro Manila area, in the Cebu area.
I kind of believe that, Gerard. I also see that, for example, in organizations that I've been with in the recent past. There's really growth in trying to get more candidates or even employees that and upskill them in terms of written skills. Okay. Actually,
Yeah,
Marisol
and
has
it's very prevalent in, like, for example, telco industries and the banking industries, where most of the correspondences right now are shifting towards the omni-channel model, and they're shifting from voice to social media platform as well.
Right.
One thing I would add to that, I think previously there was an assumption made that if someone can speak, then they can write. But there are, like, in kind of all areas of language performance, there are things that are acceptable or that wouldn't cause any concern if I were to speak them. But in a written form, certain errors are a lot more disruptive and distracting. Certain levels of formality are expected in written styles of work. There's just a more critical eye that's put on language when it's presented in written form than when it's on spoken form. And there's so much of a dynamic ability to correct or clarify when you're dealing with something in the spoken form that's a lot more disruptive, even in kind of a chat instance that's different and requires a different skill set from an agent than just the language familiarity and fluency that we would see in their oral skills.
That's true. And you get varied, a lot of people who can really speak well, but
Mhm.
are not very good communicators when it comes to written language, right? So, and vice versa. So I'm glad that we're actually talking about it, because I'm pretty sure that, you know, being in the contact center industry, we kind of think that it's all just about how well you speak. But I think putting in, you know, putting some focus on how well can people write and how we can actually improve that is also important. Marisol Judson said that the reason she asked the first question earlier is because um, assessing confidence is very subjective. So she said, I think having the available questions where answers can be yes or no helps in minimizing subjectivity and a bit objective.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, that's definitely a limitation in the type of survey research that we use. We did have kind of a follow-up question that allowed people to like give additional description in terms of any one of the answers that they wanted to. So we'll be continuing to kind of learn through that additionally supplied detail from
Okay. Great. Yeah, that would, you know, the context added to the answers in the survey would really be useful in deep dive. I have another question here. How do organizations with applicants or existing employees at English B1 level up their English level to B2? Very important question.
Yeah. I mean, some of that should happen naturally as people have opportunities to practice and expand and extend their language ability. There are a couple of barriers when I look at the expectation level between a B1 and a B2 that are important to address. One of those would be comprehensibility of someone's language ability. So reducing accentedness. A B2 speaker should be able to confidently interact with speakers that are not familiar with or not used to hearing the language presented in a non-conventional or non-traditional accent profile. So I think there's, you know, some very kind of specific targeted work around linguistic skills that's necessary. There's a volume of practice required to move someone from B1 to B2. And then I think there's just an expanding of what someone is ready to encounter in the language. So kind of widening someone's exposure to different types of language, different uses of that language are all important parts of extending that skill from B1 to B2.
Okay, that's interesting, because also in the survey that you showed earlier, most companies that you've surveyed strongly actually agreed that there is a difference in pay for employees from B1 to B2. I guess my follow-up question to that is, we know that immersion is, you know, you have this platform that you provide and you offer to companies, but do you also provide services to help companies, you know, up the level, like not just to screen people coming in, but to actually develop the talents we already have within the organization?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And you know, the long answer is that we're passionate about, again, closing this gap, and closing that gap would require us to intervene and instruct and help someone with their language development. Currently, like, our focus has been on this assessment piece. And so we've put our energy and resources, you know, we started with maybe a broader vision or broader scope that included some, you know, teaching and tutoring components. But for the time that I've been at Immersion and the time that I see forward in Immersion, we've been focused on the assessment piece that then can help other kind of instructional or interventional work be more effective. If we're confident that we know where someone's at, any material becomes more successful at helping them advance to the next step, because we're fitting the right material with the right individual. So we'll keep you posted. We do work with language development firms that use our assessment as part of their instructional arc. So there are certainly resources that we can help direct people to if they're interested in effective instruction or an effective intervention for someone to grow their skill.
That's wonderful to know, because, you know, I've also seen, for example, organizations who would really not be interested in getting or paying for tools, right? They would say, you know, I have great interviewers, I'm pretty sure that with their assessments when they interview, that should be enough for me to say whether the applicants I'm bringing into my organization meet the expectations that we would have from them in terms of language skills. And more so in trying to evaluate their existing employees. So I'm glad that, and you mentioned this also during your discussion earlier, that you are passionate about developing people, but there's always should be a way to start, and that is to assess at what level they are at.
Yeah, and just to kind of add on to your comment, I'm also confident in a skillful and trained person's ability to accurately assess a single person. I think where we often kind of overestimate a person's ability is when we add volume to a skilled language evaluator's role. When they have more to do than they have time to do it, their performance breaks down quickly. I've done a lot of training around interview style assessments, and in order to maintain skill levels and in order for that skill level to really be at its best, there's a finiteness or a limit to how much I can expect someone to do without a quickly like diminishing accuracy level from an interview potential. And what we see is that organizations need language skill assessed at greater volumes and with shorter timelines than is really humanly possible to do accurately.
Shorter timelines, I guess, is a key, especially when you have like ramps with, you know, you need to bring in like hundreds of people in a certain timeline. Right. Is that something you can relate to, Gerard? What is your experience around that area?
Yeah, definitely. Because like, for example, in tech, we do a lot of seasonal ramp ups, and, you know, it's very critical that we meet those timelines with very short recruiting lead time. So it's really imperative for the organization to invest and strengthen their current employee benchmark. For example, in tech, we do cater to local programs and local clients. And whenever we have seasonal ramp ups, we try to get people from this pool. So at least it's easier for them to transition. So because they already know the culture of the organization, right? Plus, I think what Judson has mentioned, I think earlier, and my discussion previously with Posse was, we can use language, you know, to retain people, you know, upskilling them to a certain level. Basically would be able to help retain people, because if you do that, they'd be grateful, you know, and they would have higher pays, for example, if they transition handling like a local program to an international program. So that's, you know, very important. And again, companies would have to really, you know, invest on their people, and they have to be very open and investing and upskilling them, because in the long run, it's going to improve the ROI for each of the employee they have.
And
I agree.
One of the things that I've observed as well is often the same resources that are being used to screen hires are the individuals and resources that are supposed to manage an upskilling program. And so if you're able to offload kind of the hiring and screening component, what would the language development team do with their time and those resources? Well, they would apply it more effectively to the upskilling side of the work. And they'd be able to do that in a more consistent way. I mean, as you're talking about ramp up periods, I imagine it's chaotic, it's stressful. When I was in my previous life as a university administrative position where I was screening people for placement in the language program, it was exhausting to go through these acute periods where we were doing a lot of assessment. I had to prepare before to kind of be ready for that ramp up period, and then I had to recover after. And during that time, I wasn't doing as much training and teaching as I would have wanted to do. So again, like the variability of the need for screening, to me, even more kind of speaks to how automation can help with that. It can help smooth out the demand and make it easier for people to maintain their focus on that development piece of their job.
Very interesting. Okay, so there is another question that came up, but in relation to that last, statements from you, Gerard and Judson, I think this other question is important. Have language proficiency standards changed in the past, compared to today? And is this a symptom of the talent dry out when we talk about ramps? Because that's one of the few things that we always hear. We've exhausted our resources to find candidates or to find talents. So is the proficiency standard part of that has become a talent dry out? And because it's a challenge in recruitment. So the question is, what practices can be done to address these? Of course, you mentioned, proficiency tools that can help, but do you see any other ways that we can address the talent dry out because of the changes in the language proficiency? Not sure who can answer that, but maybe
I guess it's not really the talent dry out, but like the demands are increasing like year and year from when the BPO industry has begun back in the early 2000s. So the demand is increasing, but the supply is not steadily growing as the demand is. So I think that's where organizations would have to come into when, in terms of, for example, partnerships with the LGUs or the academe, to ensure that we are able to help the community in training people, because if we are able to do that, then basically it's sort of like a pride of the community that you're helping them, and it becomes a pride of the organization too. And you're, for example, if you work together closely with a certain barangay and you're able to train their people or their residents, they'd be referring people to you. So basically that's one of the ways on addressing the sort of like quote unquote trying out of the talent. Same goes with, I think, when you partner with academies and provide them certain trainings, like for example, train the trainer, and really partnering with them and improving the level of communications that their graduates have. I think that will be a very good way to address the issue.
Yeah, I as Gerard was speaking, there were a couple of thoughts that I had on this. I think one of the exciting things we've seen through the pandemic, and as organizations have started to be a little bit more flexible in terms of where they're willing to recruit talent, I think that's opening up exciting opportunities for us to reach out to where the talent went. Where before we maybe were a little bit more restricted in areas because there needed to be a physical location and a infrastructure to get people into that physical location. I think now we're a lot more open. We've seen successful work done outside of where it was previously done in these tight centers. So I think that's an exciting opportunity. But again, I think in order for that to really, that opportunity to persist, we need to prove out that the entire cycle of employment can happen away from these fixed centers. So we need to be able to hire remotely, onboard remotely, train and maintain employees remotely. So there's certainly a challenge there. In terms of your first question, though, about like, has language proficiency demand changed, or the expectations that people have on what performance will look like or should look like? It definitely, I think, has increased. And I think one of the things I look to as evidence of that is the difference in expectation for someone's performance in English versus in other languages that are learned, like as a second language user in Spanish, as I interact with people, is there a higher level of understanding or compassion afforded me when somebody recognizes that it's not my first language? And I think definitely when on the English side, I think people have reached a point where they expect that not to do any additional work And that work is all on kind of the agent side in keeping communication flowing, where maybe initially there was patience and understanding. We're regrettably very short on patience and understanding these days. And I think we have to address that in the language skill and language skill development that we offer.
I completely agree. So, and this is, I am curious, you mentioned the third language, in your presentation, and that thing that you mentioned just now also talks about, third language out there, maybe, English, not the medium that you use, but we're looking at, other languages. So my personal curiosity is this, like, does immersion have proficiency test tools for like third language, say Mandarin, for example, because there's also an increasing demand for Mandarin, right?
Yeah, and this pairs fairly well with kind of Randall's question that came in the chat. Like, we would love for the conversation here to extend in an opportunity for us to showcase some of our language products to help you see how they are different. They are different. The things that we do have been uniquely innovative and are exciting in their ability to assess accurately. We, in addition to our English product, we have products in Spanish, French, German, Mandarin, Italian, and Tagalog actually is a product that we just barely released and launched. It feels like I'm forgetting one. There's 8 released languages and there's several more in development. We've taken the innovations for assessing someone speaking, that we found success for in English, and then have been able to replicate it in across a lot of languages. So for a company that's looking at third language performance as part of their hiring practice, we can likely provide that additional language credentialing in ways that maybe previous assessment providers who just did English or English and Spanish, we would maybe be able to help round that offering out.
Awesome. I love that because, I remember we had to hire Mandarin speakers for one account and nobody speaks Mandarin. How do you measure how well that person actually gets, the job done when your interviews in English? So great to know that you guys have that tool now to assess third language.
Yeah. Japanese is the one that I forgot.
Nihongo, yeah. Also one of them, in demand languages now. Okay, there's another question here. It says, do you have some program in sustaining the communication upskilling journey of your employees? And do you have some retention program for those who are already at the highest level of language proficiency? And then, of course, how do you retain these people, given that pirating employees is just around the corner?
Yeah. Gerard, why don't you lead out on that one? I think you'd have more substantive things to say. The first question around like, what does immersion offer in terms of instruction and upskilling? We help you start right so that you can make best use of other programs. We don't have a specific upskilling curriculum. Again, we've worked with a lot of great companies that do, and we can make those connections. In terms of a retention program, when someone's ability is, the highest, that certainly would be a challenge. Someone with great language skill has opportunities and options afforded them. We make it easier for you to quickly and easily assess that someone does have that ability, so you can put them to work right away and use them for as long as you can. And again, pirating employees, I think one of the best defenses of that is being really efficient in your hiring practices, so that if you're competing for a similar applicant with another program, you're able to close that loop quickly so that they know that they have a job with you and you're not waiting to be screened for hire.
Mm-hmm. And I think to answer that question, if someone is already sort of like at the ceiling, like best of the best in terms of the communication skills, I think it's about time that you not only look at language to develop them, but the other skills too. Because one way of how you're going to be retaining talent is to provide growth and opportunity within the organization, because someone who's already, at the peak level, can move to a different role So it's best that organizations have like internship programs, for example, or development program for other skills that are currently needed in the market.
Thank you. Those are wonderful insights. Okay. I think we have more questions here. This is coming from Randall. Would you know the difference between immersion's assessment tool and those being used by some other companies? I love that question because I actually have it in my notes. Like
Great.
between free tools that companies can avail as to help them with assessments in language proficiency, and paid tools like what we get, for example, from immersion. What's the difference? And
Sure. Some of the key differences that I see, one of the really exciting differences in our English test product is that it's adaptive. So unlike kind of a traditional test where everyone sees the same questions in the same order and responds to them that way, with each question answered, we take the performance data that comes from that question and we'll adjust the next question based on that performance. So if someone's ability is high and they're meeting the challenge of a given test item, the next item will be a little bit more challenging, a little bit more likely to give us new insight about their performance ability. So it's a dynamic test experience that's fit to their level, which means that doesn't mean that the test is easy, but it means that the test is comfortable and rewarding for the test taker because they really feel like they were able to show their best performance at their level. If they're lower in language ability, they still get a chance to show what they can do through that test experience. If they're high language ability, then we push them with increasingly difficult questions. With both, the test experience is shorter than it would be otherwise if we had to ask all of the levels of questions. And it's a smarter assessment because we've gotten more data from questions that are specific to their ability level. So that's one of the key differences, our adaptive nature of our English speaking assessment. And then, I feel confident, but a little bit prideful in saying one of the differences, the psychometric rigor, and psychometric responds to like the academic study of how you measure things reliably and accurately. We put a lot of psychometric rigor into the assessments that we develop, where others do things easily and kind of quickly and cheaply. We really tried to take the time that it takes to do something well. I also like to think that we're unique in how we try to make sure that clients who get data from our test can actually make the right decisions with that data, helping them to understand what the data means, where other products maybe they give you information, but they don't really kind of work you through assimilating that detail in a meaningful way into the organization. And then again, like all of this, the quality of the product, we've had a commitment towards making it accessible. We don't want organizations to not be able to benefit. So we work really hard to make sure that we're, cost competitive with alternatives, including the alternative of using internal resources, which has been a challenge, but exciting as well.
Do you also provide like a dedicated customer partner?
Yeah, we have a really dedicated client success team that helps through the onboarding process and beyond, making sure that people feel like the test is really being useful to them in the different ways they might be using it, whether that's employee screening or upskilling.
I think a lot of companies now, when at this age, data is very important. Data and analytics is very important, and having a tool like that can actually get leaders access to data is one thing that makes a difference when it comes to growing the business. Okay. Yeah. I have another question. It says, for organizations hiring agents for domestic clients, expectations in language proficiency will most likely be a tad lower compared to those hiring for international clients. Are these efforts to bridge the gap, such as agents in domestic programs being trained to qualify for the bridge gap as agents in domestic programs are being trained to qualify for the international programs. I guess this is the upskilling, if I understood that question
Yeah.
correctly. Yeah, Gerard, you want to share?
Yeah, yeah, and I think that there are a lot of BPO companies that's also hiring for local programs where in terms of the English communication skills, the requirement is much lower compared to, catering to an international program. But I guess as what I've mentioned earlier, it's one way of retaining these people because most of the time they would use it as a stepping stone in the BPO industry. And, if you're able to retain them and basically provide training and invest in them whenever you have, for example, seasonal ramp ups or new programs, for example, then you already have that bench where you can get from instead of as opposed to hiring someone externally where it's in terms of cost, it's more costly to hire someone externally than to train someone internally. So I think that's where for most specifically for organizations who are catering to both international and local programs, that's going to be very important and imperative that they do so.
Yeah, I would add a little bit of detail there, not to be too technical about it, but some of the earlier discussion about how much and how well we can discriminate within an ability level is important in order for us to be able to adjust up or down depending on the demands of a particular role. If we look at performance, there's a lot of variation within a B2 or a B1 or an A2, right? Those represent really large spans of performance ability. And an assessment like the immersion assessment that in addition to giving you CFER score detail, gives an incrementing scale from 0 to 100, allows you a lot of control over, for this type of account, maybe we can go a little bit lower into B1 ability than we could for this type of account where we need to be closer to a B2 in hiring. So there's a lot of customization that you can make in the hiring needs that you have with a product like ours.
Wonderful. Okay, well, this has been a wonderful discussion on the language proficiency and what companies do and how we can upskill employees. I hope that the people that have joined us today have picked up on things that will help them in their organizations. I would like to thank you, Gerard and Judson. But before we wrap this up, any final messages for our viewers and those that joined us today? Let's start with you, Judson.
Sure. Just to hope that this can be the beginning of future conversations. Again, how our work intersects may be different depending on your role, but I would be excited to hear from you and connect either directly or through one of my immersion team members to help you better serve the organization and community that you work with.
Thank you so much for spending this time with us, and we appreciate you joining us. Gerard, any last messages?
I just wanted to thank everyone for joining this session, and I think we're gonna have more of this kind of discussion moving forward, which is gonna be very helpful for the industry.
Definitely. Yeah, excited to join another one like this very soon. So again, thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Back to you, Jay.